Test. Oh, yeah, it looks like it's good. Okay. I'm Phil Wyman, and this is the Wild Theology Podcast, where the world, the humans in it, and God are all wilder than we've been told.
That's your intro.
So, you'll get philosophy and theology and crazy stories that come from 30 years of pastoring,
Boring.
20 years of festival work,
Whatever.
and the mud and blood of wrestling with the living in the spaces angels fear to tread.
Ooh, trying to sound interesting, are we?
Oh.
Yeah, you think you got something to say?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the problem, dimwit.
Like I'm a lot smarter than you think.
Yeah, you tightened your shoes this morning.
Whatever. We're Phil Wyman, and this is Wild Theology, where you get to argue with your own ideas.
And lose.
That's the point. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Phil Wyman. All right. Here I am with my good friend John W. Morehead, who is my illustrious leader in the MultiFaith Matters group that I'm a part of. And we're going to be talking about an upcoming conference that's coming in May. And, hey, John.
Hey, Phil. Good to be here.
Yeah. So, tell everybody who you are. Give a kind of little introduction on yourself, what you do. And
Oh, man. Yeah, self-introductions are a little challenging. Let's see. I've been working in multi-faith engagement for a number of years. As you mentioned at the beginning, I'm the director of MultiFaith Matters. We started as a grant team 5 years ago and have gone through an initial grant and a supplemental grant. And we have moved from being a grant team to being a fledgling organization. And I'm privileged to work with you guys, a great team. And that's just the latest incarnation of ministry that started with cross-cultural missions, and prior to that, apologetic work with new religious movements, and has expanded into more of a dialogical kind of engagement to people in other religious traditions.
all right. So you're one of those people who hangs out with weird people and is a weird people yourself.
That is definitely true. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, yeah.
Bringing it down to layman's terms.
That's right.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question unrelated completely to what we'll talk about. But this is something that I hit on quite often on the podcast, the Wild Theology Podcast. What do you think is the greatest challenge to the Christian church today?
Well, of course, the Christian church is vast and diverse, so I'm going to relate my response and my comments to the American Evangelical context, which is where I find myself doing my intra-faith work, trying to help my fellow tribes people. I think our greatest challenge is perpetuating narratives and theologies and practices of defensiveness born out of fear of the other. I think we're, for a variety of reasons, we're fearful of others, and we have lost sight of not only love of neighbor, but love of enemy. I mean, if we think Muslims or Mormons or Satanists and pagans are somehow potential contaminants and our spiritual enemies, there is that Christian tradition of love your enemy. And, so we've lost sight of that. We've lost sight of the ability to love and embrace and live with the other in hospitable and Christ-like ways. I think it's one of the greatest challenges, and as a result, we lose credibility, and we're going to reap the benefits, I think, for many generations.
So, pull maybe one or two examples out of current events that show that, what you're talking about.
Oh my goodness. Let's see. That demonstrate it's hard to find just one. I mean, there's just so many of them. So for example, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, you had the Evangelicals led the charge when a Muslim community wanted to build a mosque. They had outgrown their prior site and needed some new space, and Evangelicals were quick to lead the charge, working through local civic organizations to oppose that various zoning grounds. So they were trying to stifle the free exercise of religion of a religious group that they disagree with. So that's problematic. Yeah, I mean, so I think at the current moment, for many evangelicals, Muslims and Islam is the current boogeyman. If you look historically, Christians first, Protestants were opposed to Roman Catholics in America, and we've been opposed to Mormons, and at this cultural moment it happens to be Muslims. So it's a changing cast of characters, but unfortunately we tend to oppose rather than act in neighborly ways with other people.
Right.
Well, I mean, you've seen it yourself, and you could share examples with the way Christians have interacted with pagans. So
yeah, I feel like my life is an example at times, and that's because when you stand in the middle between the evangelical church and whoever the enemy is, they shoot right through you, or sometimes at you.
That's a good point. I mean, it's not just the way evangelicals relate to those outside the tribe. And you and I both have experienced that. Our team members at MultiFaith Matters have experienced that. Right. When you take a different approach that's not just apologetic and boundary maintenance and building walls and preaching at people or doing apologetics at them, when you enter their space and extend neighborliness and this kind of thing, then you become suspect, and you can often become the focal point of attacks from your own fellow evangelicals. So
that's what you get for eating with sinners.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. I mean, that in a sense is the same thing that Jesus was hearing. Oh, you eat with the tax collectors and the sinners. You must be one too. So you must be a heretic if you hang out with heretics.
That's true. Yeah. Maybe we could start another podcast, the Neo-Heretic blog or something like that. I don't know. Podcast.
Right. Yeah. Excommunion.
That's right.
So, describe what you mean by multi-faith context. We had this discussion at the very beginning of the whole the grant process and getting the team together. We were talking about multi-faith versus ecumenical or interfaith. And so what's a multi-faith context?
Yeah, I think that's an important definitional question, particularly since evangelicals are usually very wary of dialogue and ecumenical kinds of efforts and interfaith. And the reason why they are is they're concerned that there's going to be compromise, that when you get into it's dangerous to engage in generalities, but in general, an interfaith approach brings people from different religious traditions together, and they tend to emphasize commonality and ignore differences. In fact, sometimes in interfaith context, you have folks say, the differences really don't matter. In fact, it may be that we really believe the same thing and we're just talking about it in different ways. In essence, every religion teaches the same thing. That's not what we're about. We recognize that there are real differences between religious traditions. If you take them seriously and look at their claims, they hold to different concepts about how they understand the nature of reality and religion and spirituality and these kinds of things. So we recognize that in a multi-faith approach. But what we're saying is we don't, not at the same time as we don't ignore differences, we work through them, that we don't have to treat the religious other as an enemy or as someone that's just the object of apologetics or evangelism, that we can have conversations, develop relationships, come to a mutual understanding that can include persuasion, sharing our truth claims with each other in the hopes that they will embrace them. But that's not all that we do. It's more wide and complex. So multi-faith, I think, is a more biblically faithful approach for evangelicals to take, and it's one that's in clear distinction from an interfaith approach. Don't know if that's helpful or not.
So the tough question in that or the challenge in that for a lot of evangelicals is, and I agree 100%, it's the more biblical approach. To love your enemy, to befriend the other. Love is an expression of the Great Commission itself. I think all of these things are extremely important. But then there is the challenge that when I befriend that other and I'm hanging out with them and they're a part of my life and I'm a part of their life, there's the fear that the unique distinctiveness of evangelicalism will get lost in just making friends, just dialoguing. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. Oh, yeah. Well,
so
I don't...
How do we get past
go
that?
Ahead. Yeah, I think we need to be honest and go into this with open eyes. There is always a risk whenever you engage with someone who has radically different ideas than you do and would like to see you embrace them, whether it's politics or religion or what have you. There's always the possibility that when you get into a multi-faith dialogue that the conversation partners might be persuaded, and there are the occasional conversions and this kind of a thing. However, they happen to be very rare. I think what's more realistic in terms of fears for evangelicals is the fear of spiritual contamination. That if I get too close, that somehow I might get spiritual cooties or what have you. But I think if we look at the parable of the talents and apply this to this situation, in that parable of the talents, some took the talents and buried them and got no increase. And when the Lord returned and said, "What'd you do with that?" "Oh, I buried it, and here it is." That wasn't the one who got the reward. The one who got the greatest reward from the master who returned and said, "What did you do with it? How did you invest it?" was the one who took a risk. And so I think there's a certain level of spiritual risk that we evangelicals ought to be taking in investing in the lives and relationships with others in other religious traditions. And that's why I'm arguing out of a love ethic, of love God and love neighbor, that this is the more biblical approach.
Yeah. So over the years, we've had these really interesting encounters here in Salem with street preachers who will come from all around the United States, and they have their big signs, typically about hell and judgment. There was one classic sign. It must have been about 8 feet tall and about 4 feet wide, and it just had this massively long list of all the people who were going to hell. So it started off with, fornicators and blasphemers and things like that. And then somewhere pretty high on the list, there was the Pope. And then the list went down further, including obscure things like those who played Dungeons and Dragons and listened to rock and roll. And then in the middle of that section, in fairly large letters, it said Billy Graham. I remember looking at this sign and thinking, wow, that's going to be a really small heaven.
Yeah.
It's going to be like a tiny little deli where there's only 2 tables. But the comment that would come from those groups of people about us, this was one of the more unique things we heard over the years. That they'd say, "They're preaching a false gospel. It's a gospel of love." And we thought, okay, and that's bad. It almost wasn't worth a comeback, except the typical evangelical line tends to be, we've got to warn them about hell now, because if we don't do it now, it'll be too late later. And so we are in need of having some kind of a response, I suppose, to that kind of thinking that wants to put that out there first and fast. How do you respond to that?
Well, that is a tough one. I appreciate the concern. I remember in one of our MultiFaith Matters team meetings during the first 3-year grant period, one of our team members he got very emotional and said the reason why he spends so much time developing relationships and loving Muslim imams and so on was because he doesn't want to see them go to hell. I appreciate that ultimate concern.
Right.
But I think at the same time, if we put it out there at the forefront and are always preaching hellfire and condemnation and judgment and all of this, I just think we lose those people that we are concerned about. I think there are other ways that you can keep your ultimate eternal concerns in the mix and yet put something else out there as the starting point, as the point of engagement and connection for the other. I think their concern gets lost in the way in which they do that. I know you've run into something similar in Salem. You know, how did you address it out there?
So I often will tell people, I stand in this funny space where a lot of the people who come and minister with us in Salem want to express love, and then they want to support and encourage people. And so there's a whole category of Pentecostal prophetic ministry that looks at providing encouraging words to people who come to them on the streets. And I'm challenged even by that somewhat, because I feel it can be a little bit deceiving that truth can get lost with too much judgment, and truth can get lost with too much encouragement. Because in between all of that is truth that is on this sharp blade between the encouragement and correction might be the word for it. And so I sometimes will say to people, well, and the guys who challenge me, you know, you don't talk about hell, you talk about love, you're not telling them the truth. I really do believe in some sense that we need to give people hell now because it's too late later, right? But on the other hand, I want to be extremely careful when I do that. How helpful is it for me to tell somebody over and over, you're going to be going to hell, when they don't even believe that it exists? Right, in fact, an intellectual conversation about the possibility of a judgment of God, without focusing upon them as individuals receiving that judgment, is of more value than a person who doesn't believe that it exists, than telling them they're going to hell. I mean, I might as well be telling them they're walking into Moria, you know, and they'll just look at me and go, yeah, one simply does not walk into Moria.
That's right.
It's a mythical place for them. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. And then people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. There's that issue. So the expression of love is extremely important.
Yeah, and it not only does it speak to something that they don't even accept as a reality and as a potential threat, but it also, I think, reinforces the very negative, judgmental stereotype of what an evangelical is all about.
Right.
And therefore, you cut off any ability at communication and relationship. So I think there's multifaceted responses to it, and I think that's why you and I would disagree and pursue a different approach in our ministries.
Right. And in my disagreeing, I really I'm looking for creating a relationship that is a long haul appreciation of the person, a relationship that goes on, so it's not just a hit and run kind of approach to ministry. I want to make friends, and I want to make them for life, and I'll make them that friend. That will exist whether they become Christians or not. They're friends for being friends for friends' sake. I think God treated me that way.
Well, and I think that's an important distinction. I've done some writing with our mutual team member and friend and colleague, Paul Louis Metzger, on this. You know, many times Christians are perceived as, and I think rightly so, doing a bait and switch. Why do you want the relationship? Well, it's and I've in ministry I've seen, well, you know, you've been in dialogue with these Mormons for X number of years. Isn't it time to, you know, they're not converting. Isn't it time to cut it off? The assumption is that the dialogue, the relationships are the means to the end of conversion, and since they're not coming around, obviously move on to something else. there's got to be a place for us being understood as evangelicals in wanting real relationships with people, hoping they will embrace the gospel, but that's their decision. And if they don't, I'm not going to unfriend them. Life is not like Facebook. I'm not going to unfriend those who don't accept my extension of the gospel invitation. These are real relationships and people that I care about, regardless of their response. And I know you're the same way.
Yeah. So we've got this conference coming up. Conferences in the Word. We have this gathering coming up May 7th and 8th in Austin, Texas. MultiFaith Matters gathering for people who are ministering in these multi-faith contexts. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I'll have to cut this section off. Let me ask this question again. We have this conference coming up May 7th and 8th, Austin, Texas. Multi-Faith Matters gathering for people who are working in this context. And now our thought has been we want to provide a space for people who do this kind of work and oftentimes have nobody around them to identify with because there's struggles in this kind of work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about those struggles a little bit.
Yeah. Well, first let me say just a few words about why we decided to do this. This is a gathering, not a conference, as you pointed out. Conferences have their place. They're great. I like going to them at times where you go and you're in the audience and you have various speakers and maybe some workshops, and the goal is for you to sit and listen and to take some ideas and then go back and hopefully plug some of that into your ministry. Again, that has a place, but we're not doing a conference. We're doing a gathering. This is much more intimate. This is more relational and interactional. This is, as you said, for people who are doing this kind of ministry, whether you're a missionary, pastor, volunteer at your church working with refugees, whatever it may be. This is a place for people who are in that liminal space to come together and to develop relationships, to share your experiences, to share your struggles. This is a difficult place to be in, and so we thought, well, let's create something that is different, that will meet a need that I don't know of any other gathering like this out there, where you can come maybe at some of these conferences, you can pull a buddy or two aside and say, hey, can we talk about this issue I'm struggling with? This is an opportunity to do that, the focus of the entire gathering itself. So I think it'll be something that is needed and beneficial. So that's kind of how we pulled it all together, the idea as a team, and now we're trying to pull it together. So just a little background about how we came up with it. Now, your question was, again, I'm sorry, I lost your question in trying to summarize what we're trying to do.
Yes. So the question had to do with the kinds of struggles that we face. Like, what kind of things have you gone through? Because you've been working with people outside of the scope of Christianity, and you've been working with them in some intimate dialogues. What's happened because of that? What's happened to you?
Well,
who you getting shot at by, and what's being said about you?
There's all kinds of different things, but let me mention two that stand out. One is I began this ending in this place in ministry, multi-faith engagement, is part of my continuing journey. Like everybody else has a journey. I began as a young evangelical in counter-cult apologetics, and I thought the best and most biblical way to do things was to do the doctrinal template comparison. Here's truth, here's your error, let me refute it, and they will, of course, lovingly embrace the gospel. And the more I read and studied and looked at church history and the history of Christian mission and missiology and so on, I just came to the conclusion that this isn't the best way to do it. And so I started moving into a cross-cultural missions approach. And when I did that, I got a lot of flack from the apologetics community that I was a part of. I was in leadership, and they started questioning not only what I was putting forward and doing and recommending to others, but then it got even worse. They questioned my character, and maybe he's not even a Christian. And I moved out of the apologetics community into mission and just thought I'll do my own thing. And some of that controversy continued to follow, and it has died down over the years, but it still raises its head once in a while.
Right.
And so one of the challenges is, as we mentioned earlier in our conversation, when you are not just preaching at people or doing apologetic arguments at them to define barriers between us and them, when you're entering that space, developing relationships, having conversations, then your bona fides as an evangelical and as a Christian can come open to question. And that's right. Tough. When you are in a place where you feel, after a long, thoughtful, prayerful, reflective journey, that's where you're supposed to be. Right. And then your fellow evangelicals that you've worked with for years say, hey, maybe you're not even one of us. I mean, that's a tough place to be in. And so I've experienced that. A lot of evangelicals have experienced that. So there's that issue. And I think the second biggest one for me is when you do this kind of thing, I have rethought my faith over the years. My understanding of what is a theology of relating to the religious other. What does that look like?
Right.
If it's not apologetic primarily in its orientation, if I'm not just going to preach at somebody and then move on or rebut their worldview with apologetic arguments, what does it look like as a Christian way of life to live as a disciple in a pluralistic world? And so over the years, I've had to rethink and flesh that out as a result of my experience in ministry practice and relating to people of other religious traditions. So those are just two things that jump out for me. What about for you? What kinds of things stick out for you that you would talk about at the gathering?
I feel like the poster child of this.
We can make you that, yeah.
Yeah, I've been, getting excommunicated and ended up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for befriending neo-pagans. I feel like the poster child.
Right.
And that, when you mentioned that there's both the challenge to your faith, what kind of Christian are you, that you've befriended these people who are our, quote, enemies, as we were befriending witches and druids and shaman and neo-pagans of all sorts. And then, we were befriending atheists, our new atheists and at times Satanists who don't quite fit under the neo-pagan umbrella. All of these things were looked at as evidences that we were corrupt. If our friends are somehow wrong and dangerous, then we must be wrong and dangerous, right? That's the assumption that comes with it. But then it leaps to another place where all of a sudden there'll be personal attacks. And people will just pull anything out. All of a sudden, I'm getting called a drunkard, and that was actually one day somebody who was preaching on the streets here in Salem ran into the witches, one of the witches in town, and had a discussion. And of course, it was all about hell and judgment and the evil sins of that individual, and she responded with something that mentioned me, and of course then it was just worse because you're a friend of that drunkard, and when this witch came and told me that now I'm being called a drunkard, I thought, wow, I really made it. I'm just like Jesus who got called a drunkard. So notched that one up as a good point. But it goes from an assumption about your spirituality to an assumption about you as a person, and I don't know how that is justified from somebody who considers themselves to be a minister of the gospel. But somehow those kind of attacks are justified in their minds. And I know a lot of people who've tried to do this kind of work and have experienced these things. But to a certain degree, I think those of us who've gone there when there was nobody else to model this from, and everybody around us was doing it differently, and we took the first steps out, we're helping make it easier for the next generation of people who are doing this. Now there's somebody to model it. I didn't have anybody to model befriending witches in Salem. And there were a few people who did it a little bit, but they still always had an edge that most of the pagan community didn't trust them, because they would go after them about hell and judgment and whatever else, and play the same evangelical violin part, right? Mm-hmm. So when I stepped out to say, no, these are just regular people, and we don't have to have an aggressive spiritual warfare mentality against them, nor do we have to somehow keep away from them because of what they have may be contagious. When I began to change that model, the attack was fast and heavy. 20 years down the line now, there's hundreds of people who come and join us to minister in Salem in October, and talking to them about doing it in this way is now easy because so many people have experienced it. But, if you're kind of out there on your own, you're going to take it on the chin. But if you take it on the chin, you probably make it easier for the next person to follow after you.
Yeah, that's an important point. I think this gathering is great not only for people who've been doing this for a lot of years, but if there are folks out there who are new at this or, want to get into it and want to talk and have conversations with people who have been doing it and see how this is done, this would be a perfect place to have those kind of conversations. I'd love to hook up some young people in ministry with you and see what kind of damage you can do.
That's right. So, give details about this and how to sign up or find out more about it. What do we need to know to be a part of this?
Folks can go and see a description of the event at the MultiFaith Matters website at multifaithmatters.org. And then when they get there, they can click on the events and opportunities page. And as they scroll down, they will see a description of the conference. Right now, the way we've put it together is we're going to have, over the course of the 2 days, we'll have different segments that we'll be talking about. We'll have some folks who will be kind of beginning the conversation a little bit, not like a conference with a plenary session, but just kind of kicking things off. And we got some folks that will be doing that, like Bob Robinson from New Zealand, who's the author of Jesus and the Religions. And nice. We've got Martin Brooks from Peace Catalyst, who will be coming out. So we got some good folks who will be with us, and they can see that. And then there's a place on the website there where folks can register and let us know that they'll be coming. So they can always reach out to you or to me. My email address is johnwmorehead@msn.com, and I'd be more than happy to tell people more about what the gathering is all about.
All right. Okay, and you can reach me, Pastor Phil, at salemgathering.com, and we want to see people in Austin, Texas, in May 7th and 8th, and if you've been doing some multi-faith work, if you've got friends that are Muslim or pagan or Buddhist or Mormon, whatever other it might be to Christianity, and you got friends that are saying you shouldn't be befriending them, and you don't think it ought to be that way, they want to come see us, don't they, Don?
They do. I think this is going to be. I'm excited about this event. This is the kind of thing. I hate to be selfish, but a part of the planning process is what kind of thing would I be interested in going to see? And because I don't think I'm alone in having these interests and needs for relationships and conversations in a safe space to say, hey, man, this is what I'm going through. Anybody else going through it, and how did you deal with it? I'm looking forward to it, and I think other people will too.
I had like 20 years of pastors' conferences where I felt like it was just talking heads and people telling me things. And, it only took about 5 years of them to say, I've heard all of this before.
Right.
And it so often was focused upon, the key word would be discipleship, but it was always focused upon the people who were already there.
Yes.
And my heart was for the people who weren't there, and there weren't very many people to talk to in those pastoral circles. Because the first questions were always, what's the size of your church? and thank God, I think a lot of that has changed over the years. But for those of us who want to get outside those circles and swim into the deep waters where I think God is calling us, I need something like this. I need people who identify.
I think you bring up this might be of interest, not only, we've mentioned different kinds of people like missionaries and so on, but pastors. American evangelicalism is losing numbers. We're challenged. We're tending to, I don't want to step on any toes inappropriately, but we tend to preach to the choir. Yeah. And if you as a pastor recognize there's a dramatically changing spiritual landscape, not only do you have your congregation to worry about, but if you want to grow that congregation and reach people outside of it, you've got to understand the changing religious landscape, the different religions, the nuns, the spiritual but not religious folks out there. This is a place where you can come and talk to people who are dealing with these kinds of people, and you can learn how to connect with them in your local community. So, pastors, this would be a great place for you to come.
Yeah. So, this has been John W. Morehead with me, Phil Wyman, at Wild Theology Podcast, and we hope to see you May 7th and 8th in Austin, Texas. Thanks. Hey, thanks, John. It's been awesome.
Hey, thanks, man.
Thank you to my patrons who help make these missional travels and these podcasts possible. Without you, I couldn't do it. God bless. If you'd like to support this project, you can do so here on Patreon for as little as $1 a release. And at the most, that's $4 a month.
Why on earth would anybody want to support us?
Well, I think we're pretty cool, and maybe some people believe in what we're doing.
Oh, come on, you believe that?
Yeah.
Don't you ever think you're just a little too weird for the average person?
Yeah, sometimes.